Hello, my name is Chris Hartley, and I am an associate editor at Policy and Society Journal and an assistant professor at the Department of Asian and Policy Studies at the Education University of Hong Kong. I'm speaking today with Dr. Leslie Powell, who is founding dean of the College of Public Policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar and professor of public policy and administration at Carleton University in Canada. Professor Powell recently published an article in Policy and Society Journal entitled Transnational Policy Transfer, the Circulation of Ideas, Power, and Development Models, as part of an introduction to a special issue on transnational policy transfer. The article was co-authored with Diane Stone and Osmani Porto de Oliveira. Thank you for your time today, Professor Powell, and I'll start with a general question. What do global development and development cooperation teach us about policy transfer that we may not have already known?
Well, one of the points that we try to make in the article is that the flows of transfer also go from south to north or south to south, as opposed to the north-south transfer model that I think has been traditional or pretty characteristic of most of the literature. So that's one thing I think that the development lens sensitizes us to, that we should be thinking about. The second element that I think comes out in the introduction of some of the articles in the special issue is the way in which development cooperation can be used by countries in the South as an aspect of foreign policy. And that's something I think that's tended to be overlooked, again, because it's a bit of an interdisciplinary crossing boundary kind of issue, because we need to go from development studies, policy transfer to international relations. So when countries are operating in policy transfer mode, but using foreign policy instruments, it doesn't look like policy transfer, but it actually ends up being the same thing, basically speaking prose, but in a different mode. So I think that's important. And the cases that are brought up in the special issue are Brazil, Latin American countries, particularly just because of the case studies. But being in the Middle East, I can see Doha and Qatar as well, using development cooperation through a variety of different instruments and techniques for aid development in Asia and Africa as an aspect or a tool for foreign policies. So those are a couple of things that I think the development lens sensitizes us to.
Well, fascinating. Yes, it's a very interesting issue. I got the sense from the article that, sort of beyond sharing knowledge, that countries of the global South do have particular goals when they act as originators of policy transfer rather than recipients. And obviously, the relations side of that and diplomatic side of that is a very important aspect. In the article, you also mentioned the credibility of knowledge. So specifically knowledge held by aid organizations and donor countries. So what is the complementary role of local, folk, or indigenous wisdom in reinterpreting incoming policy transfer?
That's been an interesting issue. I mean, for me personally and intellectually, and it comes up in the introduction. The policy transfer literature, if you go back to its roots, assumed, I wouldn't necessarily call it technocratic or scientific, but it assumed that transfer was problem oriented. And so to that extent had a technocratic element to it. You were trying to solve problems, so you would try to seek the best solutions for solving those problems. And 20, 25, 30 years ago, it was much more comfortable to argue that there were certain key standards in scientific evidence coming out of economics, for example, about development, that simply should be, that were simply grounded in science and consequently should be accepted as best practice. And that continued to evolve, I think, over the last 20 or 30 years. Now, overlaying that, as you point out, and increasingly important is local knowledge, indigenous in cases in some parts of the world, but also I think a larger issue of credibility around questions like representation. So in global fora these days, everyone starts looking guilty if someone alleges that there isn't sufficient geographical representation in whatever the meeting happens to be. The other element of guilt that comes up is whether there is sufficient gender representation or generational representation, or, as you pointed out, local or indigenous representation, depending on the issue, or country representation if it's an issue that's particularly relevant to one or another country or to a region. So there's a whole zone of representational credibility that doesn't necessarily get packaged in science. And that element, I think, has been interesting in the transfer venues and networks and modes. So how that actually gets integrated and articulated with science is becoming, I think, a challenge for international organizations and a challenge for policy transfer of the more traditional variety.
Right. It is a fascinating issue when you think about the concerns about democratic legitimacy or process legitimacy in general, as they sit behind what might have been traditionally technocratic processes relying on elite knowledge and particularly on scientific issues. But the SDGs, for example, present a very interesting sort of tension as kind of proposing some first principles or best practices at one level, but being basically diffused throughout, you know, the multiple different contexts around the world, and the reinterpretation of those things. You know, assuming that reinterpretations keep some of the original policy goals or visions, and I think those tensions are very interesting, even when you think about things like climate policy and the best or the perceived practices about climate policy and what to do, and yet there's a lot of pushback. You know, even you could look at the populist side as well and the anti-science side as well, which is an interesting angle.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about the SDGs, that is touched on in the introductory article, but one of the things that I was thinking about in preparation for this conversation is that another aspect, I think, of how we need to think about transfer in a different context is not in linear terms or simply in movements of ideas or models or tools from A to B, but thinking about discursive spaces and venues and opportunity structures that are shifted and shaped depending on how ideas get articulated as part of that space. So, I mean, that sounds terribly abstract, but if you think of something like SDGs, it's almost impossible to have any kind of conversation about global policymaking without there being some reference, even if it's ritualistic, to the SDGs and whatever relevant SDG might be the case. So what has happened with the SDGs, because of its credibility, again, this is, I think, it's aspirational credibility, and because it had the entire international or global community behind it. So that gives it that kind of weight or anchoring. And then it becomes part of the furniture, it becomes the wallpaper, the part of the discursive space within which almost every policy issue needs to make obeisance or some kind of acknowledgement. Now, you may think of that as purely ritualistic or empty, but if you think of policy transfer as a series of recursive dynamics, it's not transfer from A to B, end of story. It's A to B, B to A to C, C to A, and around and around and around until you start getting grooves of channels and ideas congealing in some way. And that may take a decade before anything really begins to get some shape. So in that context, the SDG creation of the SDGs as a contribution to a discursive space becomes a really important element of transfer, but more as the creation of a venue or a channel or this kind of set of ideational assumptions that need to be taken account of in any serious policy discussion than a simple element of Lego blocks being connected one to the other and then coming up with some kind of result. So hopefully that's clear.
Well, and it'll be interesting to see how some of those ideas materialize in the lead up to 2030 and whatever becomes the successor to the SDGs at that time.
And there will be a successor. That's the point. That's the point. Yeah, there will be a successor, which will create another set of channels and venues and wallpaper and furniture around which we will maneuver in policy discussions going forward. But there will presumably have been some kind of incremental advance toward those aspirational goals in the first set of the SDGs. So, you know, I'm increasingly persuaded that policy transfer is not a destination, it's a journey. It just, you know, has its recursive, almost continuous element to it. And I think we need to capture that in our understanding of the way that it actually operates.
And it sounds like you're making a strong call for additional research there as well. And would be interesting to see, even in the spirit of learning, whether the discursive processes change in the next iteration as, you know, from whatever they might have been in this iteration, or even from the first in the MDGs. So watching that space and watching that furniture and the wallpaper as well. So the final question, I think, is COVID-19 is on all of our minds, you know, to finish up, what overlaps would you see in your observations about policy transfer and how countries are now managing COVID-19, or how some type of wisdom about how to manage it is percolating or diffusing throughout the world?
Mm-hmm. It's one of the issues that I've been thinking about as part of a research project that is being undertaken here at my college. We're looking at policy trackers for COVID-19 in the MENA region particularly, but as a result of that, or as a consequence of that, we're checking and looking at other policy trackers. So there's an interesting paradox of policy transfer here, is that I don't think we've ever seen an instance where there is as much information, comparative information available about what almost all countries around the world are doing with respect to one policy issue or one policy question. So there are policy trackers coming out, obviously, from the World Health Organization, from the UN. There's a Blavatnik School at Oxford. We're putting one out from the college here on policy responses to COVID in the MENA region. A variety of UN agencies have been putting out, the IMF is putting one out, the OECD. So there is no deficit of information about what governments are doing. So in a sense, this is an ideal laboratory for what we would think policy transfer should entail, right? That countries seeking the best practice with respect to responding to COVID, and now have an almost infinite amount of extremely detailed information to draw on. And yet what's happening is they're all going it alone. I mean, what we see are local solutions being taken, even if there are references, and I'm sure, and I know here in the government of Qatar, they are looking at best practices and adopting, but in each instance, it seems that there's a paradox here, that we have this wealth of global comparative information about what governments are doing with respect to one issue, and yet governments really aren't paying very much attention to that. So I think some of the drivers of this are that in this particular instance, you know, the local circumstances really are definitive. They're the ones that are really driving the response, depending on demographics, the economic situation of the country, the density of the population, the urban distributions, et cetera, the sheer size. Smaller countries, you know, are being able to manage a little bit better. So I think in this instance, we're seeing some of the limits of policy transfer and the reassertion, I guess, of local knowledge, local circumstance, and also certain, I've seen the term corona nationalism or biopolitical nationalism taking place, where countries are actually comparing themselves in some instances to what other countries are doing and trying to do better, or taking some comfort in the fact that they may be doing better, or some distress if they're doing worse. So there's a kind of go it alone strategy that's taking place in the COVID context that I think needs to be thought about. Again, given this kind of paradox of how much information is actually out there, but governments still having to respond on a local basis.
Well, fascinating. And like with the previous issue, there's a strong implication for the value of additional research. And I particularly appreciate the point you make about how response policies have been really deeply embedded in context, which would seem to create kind of a tension, in the sense that if the point of cataloging and comparing policies around the world is what sits behind many efforts to make an index out of response capabilities, you know, when something is as contextualized as many of these policies are, it may be a little bit difficult methodologically to, you know, to catalog, compare, and metricize all of that. But as you said, there are a lot of efforts out there, and it gives, you know, every bit of information can help, all hands on deck, and plus it creates a lot of interesting work and discussion for people like us who want to, you know, take a look at this and see what we can learn from a policy theory perspective. But thank you for that. It's just really enlightening to hear your thoughts on this. And it's been a real pleasure to speak with you today, Professor. On behalf of Policy and Society Journal, I want to sincerely thank you for the time you took. We realize you're very busy, but we hope that we can speak with you in this way again soon.
Sure, of course. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you, Les.